Shabbat Shalom. Try that again. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Okay, so, we always read Devarim on the Shabbat before Tisha B'Av, and then the Haftarah is Chazon Yeshayahu about the impending destruction of Jerusalem, which Joe read so beautifully. And today, Tisha B'Av means what? The 9th of Av. Today is actually the 9th of Av. But because we don't fast on Shabbat, the only exception to that is Yom Kippur, right? Yom Kippur, if it falls on Shabbat, it falls on Shabbat. But any other fast day, if it falls on Shabbat, is delayed by a day. So this year we observe the 9th of Av on the 10th of Av. And it's kind of like, I've always said that one of the reasons that we don't have a Monday holiday for Independence Day is because nobody calls it Independence Day. They call it July 4th, right? When is July 4th this year? Oh, it's July 7th, right? It doesn't work, but the 9th of Av this year is actually on the 10th of Av. So the 9 days before, from the first day of Av, from Rosh Chodesh Av to the 9th, are called the 9 days, right? And during this period, it's not exactly halakha, it's more like minhag, it's a tradition, is not to eat meat, drink wine, buy new clothes, get a haircut, anything that's listen to music is like considered a festive thing you're not supposed to do during this period because we're in mourning for the temple, right? But the prohibition on eating meat, and I have to say, this is something that is not like super important to me. And I remember when I lived in Baltimore, and my dad and his wife came down to visit, and at the time there was really one decent kosher restaurant in Baltimore, and we went, and I had to tell you the truth, right? I had even forgotten that it was true, and we get there, and I'm like, really jonesing for a nice steak or whatever, and they hand us this special 9 days menu, right? Like, what the heck is it? Right? It was all either, because it was a fleishig restaurant, right? So it wasn't even like good dairy. It was either fish or something carved, and it really, but that's Baltimore, right? I think in Washington, the kosher meat restaurants still serve meat. But they might have an extra 9 days menu, like if you don't want to eat meat, there's something else. But if you want to eat meat, you can still have it. But Baltimore is firmer than Washington, right? And in Baltimore, the meat restaurants are not allowed to serve meat during the 9 days. But I learned this year that there is this growing phenomenon in the Orthodox community of like charities having their dinner during this 9 day period. And you might say, well, okay, so to save money, right? But it's the opposite, because when you can eat meat during the 9 days, if you're attending a siyum, right? A siyum is a festive celebration for conclusion of the study of a tractate of the Talmud, right? And that overrides the not eating meat, right? So this charity will arrange a siyum and have a big fleishig dinner, right? And that'll be it'll be a fundraiser, and everybody will go because, oh, now I can eat meat, right? And so, not to be outdone, there are restaurants that are now having, at 5:45 every day during the 9 days, there's a siyum in the restaurant. So you can come to the siyum and eat meat, okay? And let me throw this growing phenomenon of like trying to find a way within halakha of still eating meat, right? What does that tell you? I mean, I know what it tells me, but Barnaby. Isaiah was right. Me, say more.
You know, this obsession with, this observance, shy away when it comes to the 9-day fast stretch concept of story. So obsessed with, the concept of, and they're always trying to find ways to go around it. And it just doesn't go in the first place.
Right. Okay. So it's like trying to, be technically not in violation, right? But finding a way around it. Okay. But I think that there's something deeper than that at work. Okay. And before I say what I think it is, anybody else? It's not meaningful, right? It's not meaningful. I mean, it's not simply that, God forbid, I should have to live for 9 days without meat. And it's not even 9 days, but you still eat meat on Shabbos, right? So this year, right, the 9 days that you can't eat meat is really only 7 days, right? Because last Shabbos and today, right? So, it's not that people can't live without meat for 9 days. It's that it's not meaningful. And it's not meaningful. And it's not meaningful for American Jews. And it's not meaningful for Israeli Jews, right? Because right, we read these verses tonight in Lamentations. Jerusalem lies empty and in ruins, right? And then you go to Jerusalem and you see that the national bird of Jerusalem is the crane, right? And I don't mean the construction crane, right? I mean, Jerusalem is not in ruins and it's not empty, right? So I listened to a podcast this week, the Shalom Hartman Institute. Yossi Klein Halevi who grew up Orthodox in Brooklyn, but he lives in Israel now, but he had Orthodox cousins in Jerusalem. Says the first time he ever was in Israel was in 1967, right after the 6-Day War. And his Orthodox cousin said to him, now that we've conquered the old city, there's no reason for Tisha B'Av anymore, right? And Halevi said the first time he ever consciously violated halakha was going out with his cousin for a hamburger on Tisha B'Av, the first time he was ever in Israel, because he felt it wasn't meaningful anymore, right? And I'm going to say the fact of the matter is that for most of us, this is not meaningful, right? So either we exercise our own autonomy and we say this is not meaningful, right? Or if we're Orthodox and we can't exercise our autonomy, so we fool God, right, by arranging a siyum and not, and failing to observe it in this way, right? But the reality is that it doesn't work for us. And it doesn't work for us because, first of all, because Jerusalem is not in ruins. And even though there's no temple, right? So if you ask an Orthodox rabbi, well, why do we still need to observe Tisha B'Av if Jerusalem is in our hands and Israel is independent and so on and so forth? They'll say something like, yeah, but there's still no temple, right? And lacking a temple, our Judaism is still kind of second rate, right? Because what's one of the key differences between our Siddur, for example, and the Orthodox Siddur, right? Whereas we refer to the sacrifices in the past tense, and they refer to it in the future. In other words, the question, look, everybody agrees that if there's no temple, you can't offer sacrifices, right? And what substitutes for sacrifices? Prayer and Torah study and acts of loving kindness. Right? The question is, are prayer and Torah study and acts of loving kindness permanent replacements for sacrifice, or temporary expedients until we rebuild the temple, right? And I think, you know, the belief of conservative Judaism officially is that they're permanent replacements, right? Whereas the belief of Orthodoxy is they're temporary expedients until we can rebuild the temple, right? But it just doesn't work for us. And it doesn't work for us because we don't, for the most part, we don't believe that we're in exile, right? I don't even want to ask for a show of hands, right? But if I ask for a show of hands, who believes that we're in exile? I think there would be very, very, very few hands, right? And if you believe that you're in exile, there's a simple expedient, right? Go to BWI or go to Dulles and buy a one-way ticket, and voila, you're not in exile anymore, right? And so we don't live here by circumstance, right? We live here by choice. Even if, and I look around and I think probably everybody here was born here, right? But even if you weren't born here, you still live here by choice, right? Because you could live in Israel tomorrow if that's what you wanted, right? And this is a problem. It is a problem because, and this is where I have some concern, okay? And I mean, even if I believe, and I do believe that theologically I am in exile, right? Because to use Star Wars terminology, there's a disturbance in the force, right? In other words, the Shekhinah is in exile with us, right? So it would take more time than I have right now, but I could explain to you why I believe that I am in fact in exile. But I'm not an Israeli in exile. I'm a Jew in exile, and even if you live in Israel, you're still in exile, because exile is a condition of living in a world that is not yet redeemed, right? But for such a long time, you know, American Jews and Israeli Jews, we really were joined at the hip, quite literally, right? Because in a previous generation, if I look at, you know, let's say my grandparents' generation, right? One sibling came here and one sibling went to Eretz Yisrael, and they were quite literally cousins, right? And so my dad had literally first cousins in Israel. Right, I don't know, second cousins once removed, or, you know, who knows, right? It's not, I mean, I want, frankly, after Tante Malka died, because Tante Malka was the one who kept everybody in contact, and after Tante Malka died, I pretty much lost contact with my Israeli cousins, right? So, you know, we're growing further and further apart, sort of familiarly, but we're also growing further and further apart Jewishly, right? I mean, if you listen, how many of you read about the bar mitzvah that took place, or I think it's a bat mitzvah, a couple of weeks ago, right? In Jerusalem, they have now a section of the Kotel, of the Western Wall, that is known as the egalitarian kotel. It's in Davidson's arms, right? So if you want to have an egalitarian service, there's a section where you can do it, but it's routinely disrupted, and it happened again a couple of weeks ago, and it turned out that the family, like the parents of the kid whose bar mitzvah was, because they came and they set up a mechitza and they literally tore up conservative siduri and so on and so forth. And they're like the head of the Israel Committee of the Jewish Federation, right? Well, guess what? They're not the head of the Israel Committee of the Jewish Federation anymore, right? Because that is not the kind of, because when the Israeli government lets these things happen, right? The Israeli government certainly doesn't encourage them, but it allows them to happen, and it distances people from Israel, right? Which is a problem for federations and the ADL and so on and so forth, because their mission is not really promoting Judaism. It's promoting pro-Israelism. And as it's harder and harder to be pro-Israel, right, then that mission, and I, look, I mean, I consider myself a Zionist. I have no use whatsoever for the BDS movement, but I don't think that the agenda of the Jewish community should be passing, to my mind, clearly unconstitutional anti-BDS laws, right? Let's fight them on the battlefield of ideas, right? And let's have a Jewish community whose agenda is Judaism and not simply Israelism, right? And this is a harder lift, but, you know, and certainly Israeli culture and support for Israel and Israeli music and poetry and novels and film, especially film. I mean, Israeli film is tremendous. I pitch for The Beauty Queen of Jerusalem on Netflix if you haven't seen it. It's an important part of my Jewish identity. It absolutely is, but it's not the entirety of my Jewish identity. And it is, frankly, because, as we see by this phenomenon of restaurant siyums, it's not such an important part of modern Orthodox identity anymore either. And we have work to do. And I don't mean just us as a shul, I mean us as an American Jewish community to reconstruct an identity that's not simply Israelism. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Rabbi, question.
Yes, ma'am.
This is kind of on the hypothetical or futuristic, but based on what you've said, if the temple in our lives was rebuilt, and all of the teachings that went with the original temples were to prevail, my guess is that it would be followed to the letter in Israel. How would it affect the way we as Jews in America observe? Would we, I'm sure, I'm not trying to be crazy here, I'm sure we would not be doing live sacrifices in our synagogues, but would it change our liturgy? Would we still use the Amida and the other things that we use as substitutes, or would it change us radically?
I mean, that's a great question, which I can't really answer, and I'll tell you why, because I mean, I think that there are two pragmatic reasons. Well, let's say three. Okay, three pragmatic reasons why, absent the coming of the Messiah, in which case we're living in a supernatural era and all bets are off.
Right.
Right, but absent that, there are three obstacles. Okay, obstacle one, Al-Aqsa Mosque. Obstacle two, the Dome of the Rock, right? Obstacle three, Jewish disunity, right? We would have to have an ultra-Orthodox temple and a modern Orthodox temple and a conservative egalitarian temple and a conservative non-egalitarian temple and a Jewish renewal temple And, it wouldn't, and so the Jewish renewal temple, we have to sacrifice tofu or something. It's like,
I wasn't even at that fringe. I was just thinking, God decided that the temple would be, reinstated.
So if that, then you're asking me to engage in eschatological speculation.
I understand.
Right? And your speculation is as good as mine in that case, right? Because, if God decides that, after 2,000 years of not doing so, I'm going to break into history again, then God will do what God wants. And, we may not like it, but we'll do it, right? I mean, look, the Judaism that we follow today is because the temple was destroyed.
Right.
So if the temple is rebuilt, it'll be, again, another different type of Judaism. It's a great question to which I have no answer that's really better than that.
Well, you sure did. Thank you.
Rabbi, so we have already made changes to get out from under the promise of going back to sacrifices. Look at Kehilat Shalom, the paragraph in Musa.
Right.
The conservative Siddur says, rebuild the temple where our ancestors observed and made sacrifices.
Right.
The Orthodox Siddur says
Where we will
where
make
we will
right, that
make
precisely what I said, the difference
sacrifices.
between
Change already is
the
there.
past tense and the future tense. And if you remember the old Silverman Siddur, there was a little, not a paragraph so much as like a note on top that said the plea for the rebuilding of the temple is a symbol of Jewish unity, right? So in other words, what did it say? It said, we don't mean this. We're saying this, but we don't mean this, right? And then when we came up with Zim Shalom, we got rid of that paragraph that essentially said we say it, but we don't mean it, and we just changed it to the past tense. But absolutely. So we continue with the Hatzi Kaddish before Musaf 155 or 428. And then Musaf will say that the first two pages aloud and then continue.